Hey guys! Part 2 of What If Naruto Graduates 2 years early. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 8, Kiri Chunin Exams, Jinchuriki. Sanbashi Mizuko, who had cursed his parents for giving him that accursed name for more than one reason, couldn't have missed the ominous wave of what felt like killing intent that had washed over Kiri if he were in a coma. He immediately knew what it was, since he had felt something similar from the Mizukage before, several times in fact. He'd known the Mizukage since the days back when the man had been a rather nice rank-and-file ninja rather than the despot he'd become after he'd been given the hat. The differences in the feeling between this killing intent and that of the Mizukage, however, indicated that this hadn't been a case of someone seriously pissing Yagura off. Someone had brought a Jinchuriki to the Chunin exams. Despite what an insanely stupid risk that was, and the fact that it could be thought of as an act of war if the leader of the village into which the Jinchuriki had been brought chose to take offense, someone had brought a freaking Jinchuriki to the Chunin exams. He briefly took note of the Konoha Jounin's rather unusual reactions as he signaled for his partner. The instant Kenpachi joined him, they headed out to see what the damage was. Considering what a Jinchuriki could do, especially when he or she was on a rampage, there most assuredly was damage. The only question was how much, and how much more would be caused when they were forced to deal with a Jinchuriki who had gone completely berserk. There was also the question of which of the tailed beasts they might be dealing with, as each beast had its own set of powers that could add a rather dangerous element to the mix. While it was known which village got what biju from the Shodai Hokage before the First War, it was possible that some wheeling and dealing as well as some thieving had been done over the intervening decades. There was that, and the fact that unless there was an unavoidable incident, the identities of the Jinchuriki were a closely guarded secret known only to the villages who held them. As he and his partner Kenpachi headed out into the mountains, a number of Chunin and Jounin who were also dreading what they would find joined them. Considering the possible distance that the Jinchuriki and its team could have gone during the 2-day head start they had been given, it would probably take a couple hours to find it, which would be a couple hours it would spend destroying the countryside, and quite possibly killing any Kiri genin in its path. Much to their shock, before they could reach the mountains, the wave of killing intent vanished, as suddenly as it had appeared. Damn, because of that, tracking this thing just got a lot more difficult, especially if the Jinchuriki in question now had the presence of mind to cover his or her tracks. It seemed that he and his comrades would have to find the trail of destruction the Jinchuriki had caused before he or she had regained control of him, or herself, and work his way from there. "You noticed the Konoha lot?" Kenpachi asked, after poking him to get his attention, which had apparently wandered off without him noticing. "Yeah, they recognize it," he replied. "But Konoha doesn't have a biju, so it's probably one of Iwa's whose prior host they ran into during the last war. Strange that they don't have any Jinchuriki," Kenpachi said. "I mean, their Shodai Hokage was handing the biju out like party favors, and he didn't keep one for himself? Which one would he keep? He gave the Achibi and Hachibi to Suna, the Nibi and Nanabai to Kumo, the Yambi and Gobi to Iwa, and we got the Sanbai and Rokubi, which leaves..." He counted, working out the problem through the process of elimination, and noticing an interesting pattern. "The Kyubi. They kept the fucking Kyubi," Kenpachi said, looking stunned. "Didn't the Yondaime kill it when it went on a rampage a decade ago?" he asked, half remembering a story he'd heard a while back. "Kill a biju? Yeah, right. The Yellow Flash may have been legendary, but he's not a god," Kenpachi replied. "You think we'll be able to prove it was Konoha that brought the Jinchuriki?" he asked. "Only if we find the thing," Kenpachi replied. Naruto had never been more grateful to be able to transform into objects, even though he shouldn't have been able to do so, than he was now. He couldn't turn into bandages or things like that, but he could make a few of his clones turn into stretchers. He knew that he shouldn't move his companions considering their conditions, but if he didn't move them, they could die. Their injuries had been severe enough to far outstrip his meager first aid skills and supplies. Suzum was his team's medic thanks to the abilities she'd acquired over time tending to her own training injuries, but she'd been in no shape to help him other than to occasionally give him directions. After summoning 15 clones, he had 5 of them turned into stretchers. After they did, he slowly and carefully placed Suzum, Satoshi, and Kurosaki on their stretchers, trying to be careful not to jostle them too much and aggravate their injuries. As soon as they were ready to go, he had Yamaguchi and Fujiwara placed on the other 2 stretchers before he covered them with the blankets he'd taken from their supplies. Once that was done, he slowly made his way towards the town that was on the other side of the mountains where they would undoubtedly receive help. Because of his teammates and Kurosaki's injuries, his first instinct was to hurry, but if he did so, he knew he would cause more harm than good, so he forced himself to go slow. It was dark, he did not know the terrain, and one jab from a good sharp rock would dispel a stretcher bearer, which was a very bad thing, considering the path that was ahead of him. The path before him was dangerous even in daylight, but it was the only chance his comrades had. As he worried over his teammates, he and his shadow clones traveled through the night, carefully picking their way through the darkness. As they were traveling through a small forested area sometime near dawn, they encountered a team from Kiri. Fortunately, the trio of Kirigakure Genin had been too surprised by what they saw to attack immediately, allowing Naruto to get a word in edgewise. "Do you have a medic on your team?" he asked the group of Genin who looked to be about 15 or so. He desperately hoped they did. While he'd been able to stop the bleeding and bandage most of the shrapnel wounds his teammates had received, Kurosaki and his teammates weren't looking so good. Satoshi had developed a fever sometime during the night, and it sounded like Suzum was coming down with a cold. "And if we do?" the person who'd apparently been designated team leader asked. "I have 2 black balls that I would be willing to trade for medical services," he replied. "I will also be willing to provide my services as a guard and look out for as long as my friends receive treatment." "What's to stop us from taking your balls for ourselves?" the team leader asked arrogantly. In response to this question, he summoned 20 Kage Bunshin and demonstrated for the boy that they were indeed solid. After that small display of power, the Kiri-nin had rather sensibly backed down. "What's to stop you from taking our ball?" the team leader asked in a slightly more subdued tone of voice. "The fact that it would be an absolutely pointless gesture on my part," he said, gesturing to his injured teammates. "Can you keep moving?" the team leader asked. "Yes," he replied. He would have to, since a medic could only do so much, and his friends obviously needed to get to the hospital as soon as possible. "Deal," the team leader said as he held out his hand. "If you slow us down too much, though, we'll leave you behind." After shaking the hand of the leader of the team of Kiri Genin, he pulled out the offered merchandise, hoping that he was doing the right thing, and that his new business partners would not betray him. The team leader examined the black ball he'd handed over, and found it to be acceptable. "Chiako, look after them," the team leader said as he stashed the ball in his equipment pouch. The girl who had been hanging back in a tree, obviously having been on watch while her teammates slept before he arrived, dropped from her perch and moved towards the stretchers. For some strange reason, she moved to the stretcher that contained Yamaguchi first, and pulled back the blanket that was covering him, instead of moving towards his injured comrades. From her startled gasp, he could tell that she'd gotten a good look at what was left of the boy whom she hastily covered back up with the blanket. He growled in annoyance when she uncovered Fujiwara instead of going over to his teammates. There was another gasp before Fujiwara was hastily recovered, and after what seemed like an interminable wait, the girl finally started looking at Kurosaki and his teammates. After examining Kurosaki and Suzum, she reached Satoshi. "There's not much I can do for him," the girl said to him sadly when she finished examining him. "His wounds have become infected. All we really can do now is try to keep his fever down, and hope he survives until we make it into town." Doki Iwaka woke from her nightmare screaming. She had spent half the night running, until she had become too exhausted to continue. After finding a semi-sheltered spot, she had collapsed and fallen asleep despite the fact that she'd struggled not to. How did it come to this? She wondered for what had to be the 1000th time. The plan had been so simple. When her brother's ground squirrel summon had come back and informed them that they were about an hour ahead of a Konoha team that was headed in their direction, they had spent some time discussing what they would do to them when they arrived. It had been her idea to kill them in revenge for a father she had barely remembered. When they had found the perfect spot for an ambush, she had thought that the gods had been smiling upon them. They hadn't. While she had hung back with the team's ball just in case, her twin brother and her best friend went to deal with the survivors of the trap they'd set, and they never came back. The blonde boy who'd realized that there was a trap there had turned into a monster and tore them apart. She had run before the monster could get her too. As she ran, she remembered one of her grandmother's sayings, a saying she used to ignore like she had all the rest of them. When you seek revenge, dig 2 graves, one for your enemy and one for yourself. Sanbashi Mizuko had been resting after having run in circles throughout the night when a chunin had come up to him with a possible location for the incident, as it was being called. Despite the fact that he was bordering on exhaustion, he quickly dropped everything and raced to the indicated location with Kanpachi following half a second behind. After 10 minutes of running, they arrived at what would have been an ideal camping site, if it weren't for the surrounding carnage, that is. Fortunately, it hadn't snowed the night before, so he was able to get a clear picture of what had happened. One team came in through here. Based on the tread patterns of their shoes, I'd say it was the IWA team, he said to his companion, who wasn't quite as good at tracking as him but was good for bouncing ideas off of. After finding somewhere to start, he wandered around the site, being careful not to disturb it because it was currently their only clue as to the identity of the Jinchuriki. After circling the site once, he was reasonably certain he knew what happened. 2 teams came through in this direction moving together. Konoha. I recognized the maker's mark on the bottoms of 2 pair of sandals. One of them is rather good at evading trackers, he almost didn't leave footprints, he said as he pointed another set of tracks. 3 broke away from the group, no wait, 4, near invisible child size 13 broke away as well, at this point, he said as he reached the start of a set of tracks that had nearly been obliterated by an explosion. They seemed to have moved towards the explosion when it happened. Blood pools here, here, and here indicate where the Konoha group fell after the explosion, he said, pointing to 6 blood pools, one of which was much smaller than the rest. Apparently they were hit by shrapnel, he said as he picked a small metallic object up off the ground. IWA men's size 8 and IWA men's size 11 arrived on scene shortly after, at which point Konoha winter terrain child size 13 gets up from here and moves towards them on all 4s. He says, pointing to the more distinct tracks that led from the relatively tiny blood pool to the shredded corpses, briefly wondering at the odd cyclonic pattern in the snow surrounding that blood pool. Size 13 then moves over to Konoha men's size 5, at which point his tracks turn nearly invisible again, he said as he followed what seemed to be an impossible number of almost invisible tracks which went up a path he barely wants to try in daylight, and would not have dared at night. The small tracks vanished altogether on a slick icy patch. There was no sign of size 13 or his companions in the gorge below, so it was safe to assume that he is alive somewhere. Whether he had remained on the path or climbed up or down the side of the cliff is a mystery, however. And he vanishes entirely over here, he finished, as he pointed at the icy spot on the path. So, what happened to the other bodies? Kanpachi asked. Sealed in a storage scroll to be brought back for burial most likely, he replied as his mind was turning over the puzzle of the impossible number of tracks that all went in one direction. Either that, or size 13 somehow managed to summon about a dozen Kage Bunshin and carried them. So size 13 is our Jinchuriki then, Kanpachi replied. Looks like, he replied, as he turned over the information in his mind. Funny, he would have expected the Jinchuriki of the nine-tailed fox to have caused a great deal more destruction, or have left more bodies behind based on the amount of killing intent he'd felt. So we're either looking for a girl with tiny feet or a small boy, Kenpachi said. Yes, he replied. Chapter 9, Kiri Chunin Exams, Conclusion. Sado Chiako nervously watched the blonde Konoha boy out of the corner of her eye. There was something seriously off about the boy. When the boy had come to them with his offer yesterday morning, she and the rest of the team had thought that they would be attacked by the injured comrades the boy had brought with him. After all, something like that had to be a genjutsu, right? Even with a freaky bloodline, it wasn't possible for someone to make 10 copies of themselves, was it? As it turned out, it had not been a genjutsu. The boy's companions really had been injured, and 2 of them were truly dead. While she had seen death before, she had never seen anything quite as gruesome as what had been under the blankets of the completely covered stretchers 4 of the boy's copies had been carrying. She had thought that the time she had seen a beggar bleeding out in the street after a fight over some scraps would be the worst thing she would ever see, but she had been wrong. After the bargain for aid had been struck, they had continued on their way, expecting betrayal from the boy at any moment. That betrayal never came. The boy had been as good as his word, even helping to repel a team that had attacked shortly before noon yesterday. When they had stopped for a break after the fight, Hikaru helped the boy seal his dead comrades into a storage scroll so they wouldn't attract predators or stink up the place, since he refused to leave them behind. That evening, when they had finally stopped for the night, the boy laid out a bunch of traps and joined the watch rotation, replacing her since she was needed to tend to his comrades. The thing that made Chiako most nervous now wasn't the possibility of betrayal from the boy who had so far kept his word, it was the oddities she noticed while he traveled with her team. The first oddity had been the technique he'd been using to multiply himself. The second thing she noticed was that, while his clothes were damaged and it looked like he had sustained serious injuries himself, the boy had been completely uninjured when she examined him. There had been marks where such injuries could have been, but those had completely vanished by sundown. The third oddity she'd spotted had been the fact that the boy, if that was what he was, could maintain his multiplication technique for the entire day without dropping from chakra exhaustion come nightfall. Most disturbing of all was Wataru's reaction to the boy. Wataru was a natural chakra sensor, and whatever he had seen when he turned his ability on the boy had left him shaken. Come to think of it, he'd been hanging back when Hikaru had approached the boy when the team had first met him. She could tell that her teammates were just as nervous and wary of the boy from Konoha as she was, if not more so. Normally, the 2 of them would have attacked what they would have seen as a threat, but this time they refrained, knowing that the blonde boy was only letting them live because they served a purpose. For as long as they served that purpose, the boy's power would be at their disposal to a degree rather than turned against them. The town that was their target came into sight. That, of course, was the perfect time for the being which she wasn't entirely sure was human to show its true colors, since he wouldn't be needing them anymore. She had done her absolute best to stabilize his companions with the limited resources she'd had at her disposal, but she had only been marginally successful. The boy that the blonde had called Satoshi was barely clinging to life, and his fever had risen to a dangerous degree. The other boy had developed a fever as well, and the girl's cough had gotten steadily worse, to the point where she could barely breathe. As the town got ever closer, however, the boy kept doing what he'd been doing all morning, which was walking point while his copies carried his injured companions behind them. The town continued to get closer, and the boy made absolutely no move to attack. Finally, when the tension had become almost unbearable, they reached the town. Once within the town limits, the boy said, "Thank you," before he departed and headed to the medical building with his copies and injured comrades trailing behind him. That was it. Thank you, and then the child that had haunted her nightmares during what little sleep she had managed to get the night before was gone. Soon she and her team were handing their balls over to one of the exam's proctors, and they had something new to worry about. Namely, the third phase of the exams. Naruto sat in the medical center's waiting room alongside Tetsuo-sensei and a jounin named Morishita. He had absolutely nothing to do at the moment, and the anxiety and fear for his teammates had faded to a restless boredom and vague sense of worry over the hours since they'd arrived. In the beginning, there had been something of a panicked rush as he'd gotten Kurosaki and his teammates seen to. Then, Tetsuo-sensei and Morishita-san arrived with a couple of the other jounin sometime during the general flurry as several medics examined and started treating the injured. Not knowing what else to do with them, he had handed the remaining black ball and the white ball that he'd gotten off the team he'd helped the Kiri team fight off to a proctor who had arrived with Tetsuo-sensei. As his team was in no condition to fight and wouldn't be in the next 24 hours, they were naturally disqualified. He knew that they would be disappointed to hear that when they woke up. After his comrades had finally been whisked off to treatment rooms, and he'd been pushed into the small, drab waiting room, he had given the scroll with Yamaguchi's and Fujiwara's bodies in it to Tetsuo-sensei since he hadn't known what to do with that either. He didn't know why Tetsuo-sensei had opened the scroll then and there, but he did, and Morishita-san started crying the instant she saw the bodies. Instead of resealing Yamaguchi and Fujiwara into the scroll that the Kiri genin had given him, Tetsuo-sensei and one of the other jounin each pulled a black-bordered scroll from their vests, and sealed them into those before handing them to Morishita-san, who then took them and sat there staring at them and crying for hours. He felt a little like crying himself, but it seemed that all of his tears had dried up somewhere on the journey between where his comrades had died and here. After Yamaguchi and Fujiwara were resealed in their new scrolls and handed to their sensei, Tetsuo-sensei and the other jounin senseis started asking him questions about what had happened, and about the Kiri team he'd traveled with. During the interrogation, they asked him a bunch of questions about the fact that he couldn't remember what happened between the IWA Nin killing Fujiwara and him helping Satoshi except for a whole lot of red. Eventually, though, they had finally stopped asking him questions after he'd been forced to repeat his answers several times, and he had been left with nothing to do but sit with Tetsuo-sensei and Morishita-san and wait for news about his teammates. While he was trying to decide whether or not it would be okay to find something to do considering the situation, the two jounin he had met on his first day in Kiri walked into the room. They barely glanced at him as they passed by him, but, as they were about to go through a door into the treatment area, the shorter one stopped. "Those are about a size 13, aren't they?" the man asked his companion while pointing at his shoes when the man stopped upon realizing that his companion wasn't right behind him. Both men turned and gave each other strange looks before they continued on to the treatment area. Not knowing what that was about, he decided to ignore it. Morishita Kanako had cried until all her tears were gone, and now, there was nothing left but the wait to learn the fate of her remaining student. It was a cruel and bitter irony that the one she'd determined the most likely to end up accidentally killing himself was the only surviving member of his team, and even his survival was questionable. It had been Naruto's actions that had allowed even one member of her team to make it this far, but still, a part of herself that wanted to find someone to blame was turning against him. Since the filthy IWA genin who had done this were dead, the vessel of the demon fox was as good a target as any. Why hadn't he taken point in the first place? He was the most obvious choice, since he was so good with traps. As she was finding more reasons to blame Naruto for what had happened, a stray thought cut through her dark musings. Was this how it started? She thought. When the giant fox was gone and there was no one left to blame but a newborn baby, was this how it started? The ones who had done this are gone, and here I am sitting here blaming the one who brought one of my students back alive, and brought the other two's bodies back so they could be buried instead of left to rot in a foreign country. I should have been blaming the ones responsible, not the one who brought little hero back, but here I am blaming him anyways. After coming to that realization, she found herself feeling even worse for blaming the one whose actions left her with at least one of her students, the one who had carried the bodies of her other students for a night and half a day, despite the fact that it would have been far more prudent to have left them behind to be retrieved later if at all. She really felt like a bitch, especially because the boy she had been blaming for the incident, since the culprits were dead and he was an easy target, had been blaming himself for the loss of 2/3 of her team. There was one thing that particularly worried her as well as the other jounin about the boy who was tearing himself up over the deaths of her students, and that was that Naruto had been so upset over the deaths of her students that he'd drawn out so much of the Kyuubi's power so quickly that it had come out completely undiluted, and caused him to go berserk. Who was to say that the boy wouldn't become so upset that he draws out more than just power one day? The kid hadn't been taught how to deal with his emotions, and the way he seemed to deal with anger was to ignore it until it became too much, which was probably the most dangerous way to deal with such an emotion. This was partly the fault of Konoha as a whole, as virtually all of the villagers had been treating him like an outcast at best and a ticking time bomb at worst. As it turned out, they'd all been stomping on a fucking landmine all this time without even realizing it. When they got back to Konoha, she was going to make damn sure that if such a thing happened again, it would be while the boy was pointed at the enemy, not while he was in the village or amongst comrades. The death of a comrade had been the first trigger. Who knew what the second would be? Sanbashi Mizuko had been understandably surprised to find the Jinchuriki he'd been looking for sitting quietly in the waiting room of the local hospital when he went to interview the medics who had treated a trio of Konoha genin who had injuries that were consistent with the explosion that he'd investigated the day before. He should have known that this would have been the case though, considering the markings on the child's face. All Jinchuriki had some such oddity that marked them as containers of a biju. The pupilless pink eyes that looked like a dojutsu were the Mizuki's. Should have guessed it was him, Kenpachi said. I knew there was something off about him when I first saw him, but I thought it had something to do with the fact that the kid was standing outside of the home of someone who was suspected of collaborating with Momochi. I just remembered something the kid said when that girl he was eating ramen with on the first day we saw him went fishing for a compliment, he said, after thinking back on everything he knew about the kid. Do you think his parents really died protecting him from the Kyuubi, considering? Died to protect him from the Yondaime Hokage more like? Kenpachi replied. After the two Kurigakure Jounin had come to their conclusion, time passed as it always does, and Naruto kept his vigil at the hospital while it did. While he waited for Kurosaki and his teammates to become well enough to travel, he kept himself occupied by chatting with the doctors and nurses, and visiting all of the patients, even people he didn't know. His cheerful presence brightened the days of many, and darkened the days of the few who saw him as an annoyance. Eventually, the day he was waiting for had finally come, and Kurosaki and the Kami twins were well enough to be sent home, even with the mountain hike taken into account. All too soon, all of them were on the boat home. While they all looked forward to their return to Konoha, they also dreaded it. Yamaguchi and Fujiwara's deaths had really begun to sink in on the trip back, as well as the fact that Kurosaki and the Kami twins would soon be facing a Konoha that didn't have two of their friends in it. In Konoha, the Hokage sighed as he looked down at the form he'd received via courier. The lots for the locations of this cycle's Chunin exams had been drawn, and the summer exams would be taking place in Iwa. There was no way in hell that he would be letting Naruto get within 50 miles of that place before he was a Jounin, even if he didn't take the boy's recent actions in Kiri into account. Naruto would of course be disappointed to learn that he wouldn't be taking the exams with his team this summer, but there was always Suna in January. Chapter 10: Recovery. Standing by the main village gate, Naruto smiled sadly and waved as his teammates headed off to the Chunin exams in Iwa. He was sad and disappointed that he wasn't going with them and would really miss them while they were gone. But, as Old Man Hokage explained, this was probably Kurosaki's last chance to become a Chunin, probably even Kurosaki's last chance to remain a ninja, and he understood. So, while it pained him to do so, he had allowed Kurosaki to take his place on the team while they took the exams this time. Morishita-san had let Kurosaki go several months earlier because she hadn't been ready to deal with the extra students she would have had to take on to balance out the team, and because Kurosaki had been a reminder of what she had lost. Kurosaki's team had been Morishita-san's first time training genin, which made the loss all that much more painful because she hadn't yet learned to not get too attached to them. Fujiwara's and Yamaguchi's deaths had hit Morishita-san hard, and she hadn't been doing too well since it happened. If she hadn't chosen to fixate on him for some strange reason, it was quite likely that Morishita-san would be dead by now as well. After Morishita-san had dismissed him, Kurosaki hadn't gotten on with any of his new teams, and had been transferred 3 times in the last 5 months, even being placed on a rookie team from the spring cycle that had graduated in April. If he didn't pass the Chunin exams now, it was quite possible that he could be let go from the ranks, as he had gained a somewhat unearned reputation of being disruptive to any team he worked with. Kurosaki got on with Naruto's teammates okay since they were friends, however, so there was still a chance that they would pass this time, even though they were extremely wary of taking the exams again, considering what had happened last time. He himself could always pass the Chunin exams next time they came around, which would be sooner in January, but still, he had wanted to take the exams to prove to everyone that he had what it took to be a Chunin, and to prove to himself that he could do it. Prove to himself that he could handle taking the test again without turning into a nervous or paranoid wreck, or worse, losing it so badly that he ends up coming to standing over bloody corpses of either enemies or comrades with absolutely no memory of how it had happened. After his team finally vanished in the distance, he turned away from the gate and walked back into the village proper. He passed by Konohamaru's hiding spot without a word as he headed to his favorite swing in the tree by the academy, where he planned on waiting for Iruka-sensei to get off work. He didn't know why the Hokage's grandson followed him around like he was his personal hero or something. He just smacked the kid for nearly getting himself killed, and if the Hokage had been a half-second slower when he'd reacted to something he perceived to be a threat that day, he would have been short one grandson. Most of the time, the attention was somewhat flattering even if he felt it was undeserved, but right now he wasn't in the mood for it or any of the games of ninja or any of the other games or activities that came with it. Eventually, he arrived at the academy, and when he reached the tree with his swing on it, he measured himself against the mark that Iruka-sensei had made when he was 8. He still had a long way to go until he reached that mark, and he knew full well that the road to his goal would be paved with innumerable difficulties, but that still didn't mean that he would give up before he got there. He had sworn long ago that he would become Hokage, and he never went back on his word. Konohamaru watched as the boss passed him by without a word. Naruto was in one of his moods again, and he's reasonably certain that it was because of the boy who went to the Chunin exams with his team instead of this time. The boss had started to tell him the story about what happened once before, but before he got too far into it, he suddenly clammed up and refused to say any more. The boy who had gone to the Chunin exams instead of Naruto had somehow lost 2 teammates in Curie, and Naruto had been there to see what happened. When he had first met the boss, he had only just gotten back to Konoha, and had only just started recovering from what had happened during the exams, and had been exceedingly overprotective of the people he cared about. It had been one of those days when Ebisu was more boring than usual, and so he had decided to run away from the man's droning lecture. After making his escape, he had gone over to the administration complex to make his usual attack on Grandpa. Unlike every other time where Grandpa would either sigh and lecture him, or simply pat him on the head and hand him off to a frantic Ebisu who would then lecture him about why attacking the Hokage was wrong, he found himself being slammed to the ground before he could even get within 6 feet of his grandfather. When he looked up to see who had done this, he found himself looking into a pair of cold, merciless blue eyes. The eyes he'd found himself looking into turned out to belong to a blonde-haired boy with whisker marks on his cheeks who was wearing a dark orange and brown jacket. He barely noticed any of that, however, as his attention was focused on the very real and very sharp kunai that was held tightly clenched in the boy's fist. A kunai that hadn't been jabbed into one of his vital organs or slid across his throat because his grandfather was holding the boy's wrist, preventing the boy from doing so. "It's okay, Naruto," Grandpa said in a soothing tone that was clearly meant to calm the boy down. "You can let it go. It's just my grandson Konohamaru. He wasn't really trying to hurt me." Eventually, the blond boy released his hold on the kunai, which his grandfather then took, and let him up. When he got up, the older boy slapped him across the face. "What the hell did you go and do a fucking stupid thing like that for?" the boy yelled at him. "You could have gotten yourself killed." the boy had hit him. Nobody had dared hit him before, nobody. And nobody had deemed him enough of a threat to warrant attacking him before when he attacked Grandpa either. Since then, when he caught Naruto when he was in a good mood, the boss played with him, and taught him stuff, and they had fun together as they went on a number of adventures. When the boss was in his other mood, however, he knew to give him space and wait for him to be happy again. Sasuke scowled as he passed the Uzumaki boy, who was sitting in the swing near the academy as if he belonged there, when classes let out for the day. The idiot was still wearing that stupid Hittite as if he believed he were a ninja, and amazingly enough, people still let him get away with it for some reason. There was no way in hell that the Uzumaki could have become a ninja before him. If anyone was going to be graduating the academy early, it would have been him. Iruka had countermanded his entry into the academy graduation exam when he'd signed himself up for it at the end of last year, saying that he was not yet ready. And that went to further prove that it was completely impossible for the Uzumaki to have graduated because, if he, who was at the top of his class and shoo-in for Rookie of the Year, was not ready to graduate, then there was no way in hell that an idiot who had been at the bottom of his class before he dropped out could have been ready to graduate over a year and a half ago, or could ever be. Deciding to ignore the moron, who would undoubtedly try to pick a fight with him if he said anything to him, because he had better things to do than fighting idiots who couldn't hack it at the academy, he made his way back to the Uchiha district to train so he could grow strong enough to defeat that man. The lessons at the academy were far too easy and low level for his tastes, and he needed to get stronger faster, so he could kill that man and avenge his clan. The bastard was still out there, and he wasn't going to drop dead without his help. As Ino departed from the academy, she turned to see what Sasuke-kun had looked at before he left. It was Naruto. She didn't know why Sasuke pretended that Naruto had dropped out of the academy, but since she was going to be the future Mrs. Uchiha, she had to pretend that he dropped out of the academy as well. Deciding to ignore the Uzumaki, she turned her attention back to her Sasuke-kun, who was far more important, and who was leaving. With a cry of, "Sasuke-kun, wait!" she raced after Sasuke, whose back was receding in the distance. As he made his way across the academy grounds, Shikamaru briefly studied Naruto. That boy was a puzzle, and a rather difficult one to solve at that. One thing he could never do was leave a puzzle unsolved. They had a tendency to bother him until he finally turned his focus on them and solved them, just so he could finally relax without the puzzle in question constantly occupying his thoughts and ruining what would otherwise be a good day. When the Uzumaki boy had been a student at the academy, he had been held up as a prime example of an idiot and acted as such, though, admittedly, on further reflection, a number of the pranks the Uzumaki boy had pulled had required a great deal of planning and covert effort on the Uzumaki's part. The fact that he managed to catch Chunin, who knew to be wary of such things in even his most basic pranks, also hinted at a higher level of skill than the one the teachers would admit to. But still, the boy's standard skill set and test scores while he'd been at the academy had been at the extremely low end of acceptable, and barely at that, and there had been no evidence that he'd been faking his lack of skill, or doing the minimum amount of work necessary to get by like he did. Outside of the academy, however, the Uzumaki boy had become something else entirely. He had defied all expectation, and become a capable shinobi in his own right. Not only that, but outside the academy, the boy was rarely, if ever, called an idiot, and was hailed for his skill. How had this happened? By all accounts, the boy who had been at the bottom of their class, and had not been ready to graduate according to current standards, should have been an absolute failure in the field. In one word, Naruto was troublesome. When Chuji heard Shikamaru's mutter of troublesome, he turned to see what his friend was looking at. Quite often, things Shikamaru found to be troublesome were interesting in his book. As it turned out, Shikamaru had been looking at Naruto, who was hanging around on the swing for some reason, probably waiting for Yumino-sensei to get out, since he'd seen them talking a few times before. To be honest, he probably would have completely forgotten about the boy despite the amusing pranks he used to pull, if his dad didn't bring him up a great deal. When his dad mentioned something Naruto had done, he would often refer to him as the little thief, and he had often wondered what it was the boy had stolen because, when Naruto was in the academy, he never took things that didn't belong to him unless doing so was part of a prank. At first, he had thought it was the Hittite that Naruto had been seen wearing around town since he'd heard from several of his classmates that Naruto wasn't really a ninja, but he rather quickly learned that was not the case. As his father had used the words genin and Uzumaki in the same sentence without the words is nada between them on more than a few occasions, most often in the query, "Why are you not a genin like Uzumaki?" He had once heard his dad and Shikamaru's dad talking about something that Naruto had done during the Chunin exams a few months back, but he didn't hear exactly what it was that had supposedly happened because he'd been discovered and sent off to do chores before his and Shikamaru's fathers resumed their conversation. Whatever it had been that Naruto had done, it had been big. Now, when his dad talked about the little thief, there was a tone of admiration in the man's voice that was usually reserved for people like the yandere, and it made him jealous. Trying to see what it had been about Naruto that had caught Shikamaru's attention, he watched the boy for about a minute. He wasn't doing anything interesting though, just sitting in the swing like he used to do when he was feeling depressed back when he was still an academy student. Boring. Shrugging, he turned and continued on his way back home where his mother undoubtedly had his afternoon snack waiting for him. Naruto-kun! Hinata sighed from her hiding spot, which had a good view of the boy in question. She had admired Naruto for years, ever since that day Naruto had brushed off the ridicule of the entire class and kept trying despite the fact that he kept failing as well. He had something she could never have, even though she tried and tried and tried. Despite the incredible adversity he had gone through, Naruto had never retreated. Whenever life knocked him down, he got back up and started climbing even higher. She wished she could be like him, then she wouldn't be such a disappointment to her father and her clan. At the very least though, she could always be there for Naruto, even if he didn't notice her. When Hibachi noticed where his friends were headed, he steered them away from Naruto. He could tell that the other boy was in no mood to talk. His friends looked like they wanted to go over and speak with him, probably so they could say that they had. Naruto was something of a notorious figure in the class, and much of the rest of the academy for that matter, and not just because of the pranks of his which had become legendary in the year and a half since he left. He knew that he'd royally screwed up when it came to Naruto. He had had a chance to have him in his group a few years back, and he totally blew it. Now, based on what he heard his dad say to his friends, Naruto was some big hero, and if anyone ever asked him about him, all he would be able to say was that he'd constantly rejected him, and once even tried to trick him into getting himself killed by enemy ninja while he was still at the academy. There wasn't much he could do for Naruto now, but maybe he could give him some space right now, and defend him when Sasuke and his fan club were on one of their "Naruto is a dropout, not a ninja" kicks, instead of remaining silent like everyone else usually did in order to not antagonize the Uchiha later. Sakura growled when she saw Naruto sitting in the swing, still wearing that stupid headband as if he were a ninja. There was no way that Naruto could have become a ninja before Sasuke-kun. Sasuke-kun was completely awesome, and the best of the best. And if Yumino-sensei said that he wasn't ready to graduate just yet, then that meant that the dropout who was still rather pathetically pretending to be a ninja most definitely hadn't been. Upset over the fact that Naruto had dared to cheapen the sacrifices that real shinobi made for the village every day by wearing that Hittite as if he had a right to, she decided to give Naruto a piece of her mind with her fists. So, instead of chasing after Ino Pig and Sasuke-kun, who had already disappeared into the distance by the time she'd gotten out the door, she turned in the Uzumaki's direction, stomped over to the boy, swung her fist at his head, and found herself lying pinned on the ground face first with her arm pulled up behind her back and someone sitting on top of her. "I might have let you get away with that while I was at the academy because I liked you, but I'm not going to let you take advantage of my kindness in such a manner again," the person sitting on her back said. "Allowing myself to be abused in such a manner is not behavior befitting a shinobi." Despite the fact that I am loath to do so since you already attacked me, I'm going to let you up. If you try to hit me again, however, I'll break your arm. Before you even think about testing this, I'm going to warn you right now that I'm not going to go easy on you because you're a girl, since that's just a bit of civilian nonsense, and I've learned the hard way that girls are just as dangerous as, if not more so than, boys. If you think anyone will make a fuss over me breaking your arm, well, let's just say that you don't want to be there when they learn that the reason your arm was broken was because you were suicidally stupid enough to try and attack a ninja. The person who was kneeling on her back said as he released her arm and got off of her. When she got up, she found herself facing Naruto and shivering as she looked down into a pair of cold blue eyes. Despite knowing that it was just Naruto, and that it was a cowardly act to do so, she ran. Iruka smiled sadly as he watched the exchange between Naruto and Sakura from his spot by the academy doors. It was quite obvious that the boy still hadn't recovered from his ordeal during the Chunin exams. The boy had better control over his reactions to perceived threats though, especially considering the fact that, shortly after he returned from Kiri, Naruto had nearly killed the honorable grandson when the child had made one of his daily attacks against the Hokage in his presence. Trauma combined with shinobi training often had dangerous, and sometimes tragic results. Watching fellow ninja, or any person for that matter, being killed right in front of you there were no words for what it was. What Naruto had gone through though was several magnitudes worse than merely watching someone die in front of him, and it was amazing that the boy hadn't developed some very serious problems or dropped out of the ranks altogether like many genin who had experienced something similar had done. He understood exactly where Naruto was coming from, having been there himself at one point. There had been a reason that he'd requested to be transferred to the academy, and it wasn't just because he'd almost gotten himself and his teammates killed because of his kindness and misplaced sympathy for the enemy. "So, how would you like to get some ramen?" he asked when he walked over to the boy after Sakura had run off. The bright smile he got was all the answer he needed, and it warmed his heart to see it. Naruto had just been drifting along for a while, but now, it was obvious to him that the boy was well on his way down the road to recovery. Naruto would eventually be able to get past what he'd gone through for the most part one day, just as he had. Chapter 11, Pranks and Revelations. Naruto felt a slight pang of jealousy as he greeted the three newly minted Chunin who had just returned from IWA almost 2 months after they had departed as genin. If he'd been given the chance, one of those three could have been him. He didn't begrudge Kurosaki his new status, however. The other boy deserved it, and now that Kurosaki was a Chunin, he wouldn't be stuck with a team of little nosy Parkers who went prying into things that didn't concern them like that rookie spring lot did when Kurosaki had been placed on a team that had graduated in April. Without being stuck with genin he couldn't work with for a variety of reasons, there was a good chance that his teammate's friend and former classmate wouldn't be dropped from the shinobi ranks, as he would otherwise have been. "Congratulations, you guys!" he yelled when they finally reached where he'd been waiting by the village gates, honestly happy for his now quite possibly former teammates, and Kurosaki, even if he was also the slightest bit jealous. "Thanks," Suzume said as she pulled him into a tight hug that left marks from the pockets on her new vest on his forehead. "Don't worry, Naruto, we won't forget about you now that we're Chunin," Satoshi said as he ruffled his hair. Despite the fact that he hadn't cared for it all that much, Satoshi had always been able to do that, because he had always been larger and stronger than him, even before he'd hit that growth spurt. Looking at him now, he could swear that the older boy had grown at least another 3 centimeters in the 2 months since he'd left for the exams. "Thank you, Naruto. I couldn't have done it without you," Kurosaki said, shaking his hand the instant his teammates had backed away a bit and given him room to do so. When Tetsuo Sensei had dragged the new Chunin off to a local shinobi bar to celebrate their promotion, he joined them even though, as a genin, he was only allowed non-alcoholic beverages. Satoshi slipped him something while Tetsuo Sensei wasn't looking or, more likely, pretending to be not looking, and he, Suzume, and Kurosaki had a good laugh over his expression after he got his first taste of alcohol. It wasn't quite what it was cracked up to be, and he honestly didn't know what the attraction was since it tasted awful. In the months that followed that day, it had pretty much been just him and Tetsuo sensei, as his Chunin teammates had signed up for the more lucrative B-ranked missions that he wasn't allowed to go on as soon as they could, and since he was still a genin, he couldn't be left to his own devices. Eventually, things settled into a bit of a routine as he and Tetsuo sensei got used to being alone together. Until the Hokage had dropped a bombshell at the beginning of October that was. Despite his and Tetsuo sensei's numerous protests, when the autumn class graduated at the end of the month, he was to be placed on a new team and given a new sensei. Apparently, one of the potential senseis had requested him, and the Hokage had seriously considered the request instead of telling the Jounin where they could shove it like he would usually have done. Breaking a team apart in this manner was just not done, even if the team had mostly broken up because of Suzume's and Satoshi's promotions. The Hokage hadn't needed to do this because Tetsuo sensei could have asked for a pair of new graduates to fill out the team roster if the fact that he was alone on the team was so much of an issue. There was another fact aside from that he was being taken from Tetsuo sensei that made this change in team doubly suck. The academy had 2 classes for each year, spring and autumn, and both classes let out 2 months and change before the Chunin exams for some reason. Since no sensei was dumb enough to even think about trying to nominate their students for the exams that took place 2 months and some odd days after their graduation after what happened to the only one who had been dumb enough to do so, that meant that if a sensei was dumb enough to nominate a bunch of rookies for the Chunin exams, they would have about 8 months of training under their belts before they took the exams. What this boiled down to for Naruto was that, if the new team he was placed on passed both parts of the graduation exam, he would be missing the winter Chunin exams in Suna, and quite possibly missing the summer exams which were to take place in a location that was as yet to be determined as well. He was naturally rather miffed about this little fact, especially since the chance of a field promotion was practically nil during peacetime. At the end of October, much to Naruto's ire, he was sent a set of orders that confirmed the fact that the other 2 members of his new team had passed the first part of the academy graduation exam, and that he was to report to the academy in a few days' time to join the new Team 7 and meet his new instructor, one chronically tardy Hitaki Kakashi. He hadn't gotten further than his new sensei's name before he crumpled said orders and burned them, not bothering to read the names of his new teammates. While Kakashi wasn't the worst of the jounin he had met, he wasn't the one he would have picked considering the fact that the man always kept everyone waiting for hours. Despite the title he would now have to call the man by, Kakashi certainly wasn't his sensei, even though he had gone out of his way to teach him things sometimes. He liked Kakashi, but he wasn't sure about how he'd felt about the man now that he'd convinced the Hokage to take him away from Tetsuo sensei and give him to him instead. When it came to his teammates, he just hoped he didn't get Sasuke or Hibachi on his team. Sasuke had constantly frustrated him with his perfection at just about everything he did, and turned himself into something approaching an enemy when he had refused to acknowledge the one accomplishment that he had managed to make before the jerk could. Despite the fact that it may seem so, he wasn't ignorant of what Sasuke had been saying about him at the academy, as he'd have to be incredibly dim-witted not to notice something like that for nearly 2 years. He just chose to ignore it. When it came to Hibachi, well, Hibachi had once sent him into a death trap while pretending to be his friend, and was therefore definitely not the sort of person he wanted watching his back on missions. Despite the fact that it was somewhat juvenile of him, he decided to express his displeasure at the orders he'd received that afternoon by pranking the Hokage. He still occasionally pranked people to keep his skills sharp while in the village, but after he made genin, he had never pulled one on the Hokage, having taken his role as a shinobi of the leaf seriously. The old man's 2-year reprieve was at an end, however, and tonight the old man was going to learn this little fact the hard way. It had been nearly midnight when he finally snuck into the tower to pull his prank. Getting in had been easy since Konohamaru had left his goddamn window open again. No matter how many times he told the boy, he never learned. Apparently, despite the dangers of doing so, the kid couldn't sleep at night unless he had fresh air, even if that meant that he had to cover himself with half a dozen blankets to keep warm. The instant he was inside Konohamaru's room, he closed the window with a sharp snap, waking the boy who had been huddled under at least 6 blankets. He swiftly covered Konohamaru's mouth before the boy could make a noise that would alert one of the tower guards. "What did I tell you about the window?" he hissed to the boy who had the decency to look slightly guilty. "You're lucky it was me and not an assassin. One of these days, you're not going to wake up at all. Now keep quiet, I'm off to prank your grandfather." With that said, he left the room, hoping the evil grin on the small boy's face was for the idea of his grandfather being pranked, rather than the fact that he planned on, say, alerting the guards to his presence, for instance. As it turned out, the elderly Hokage had been on the toilet when he reached the old man's room, which gave him a chance to shore sheet the old man's bed and put some goop on his bedroom door handle. The main part of the prank, however, was going to take place in the Hokage's private office, which he and several Kage Bunshin would be repainting in a most creative manner. As he made his way to the Hokage's private office/study, he could have sworn that he heard a noise coming from the vault that the Hokage kept his most valuable scrolls in. Curious, he decided to investigate. Mizuki whirled around to face the person who had opened the door to the scroll vault that he was currently robbing, prepared to fight his way out with his prize, which he would be presenting to Orochimaru in exchange for the rank of Jounin in Odogekure. The person who had opened the door and caught him in the act wasn't a guard or the Hokage, however. It was the Kyuubi's vessel, who most clearly did not belong, since the boy had not immediately summoned the guards, making it apparent that his nocturnal activities in the tower were illicit as well. He quickly came up with a plan as he stood there waiting for the demon brat to make a move. He'd need a fall guy whom the theft could be blamed on after all, and who better to blame than the demon child? He knew his plan would work because, what better way was there to win the demon over to his side than to reveal that he had been betrayed, and make him want revenge? In every tale he'd heard about demons throughout his childhood, they had all sought revenge against those who they believed had wronged them. The hero had always defeated the demon in the end, however, and in this case, he was the hero. "Do you know why everyone in the village hates you, Naruto?" he whispered to the boy who had stood there and stared at him with a look of disbelief on his face for the several seconds it had taken him to come up with his ingenious plan. "Huh!" the brat said blankly, wearing that stupid look he remembered from his early days as an assistant instructor on his face. 12 years ago, the Hokage made a law. A law that stated that if anyone told you why they hated you, they'd be executed. Because of that law, everyone's been lying to you, even your precious Hokage, since the day you were born," he continued in a dramatic whisper. "Dude, you're in enough trouble as it is. If you could get executed for telling me, you really shouldn't," the demon brat hissed in a desperate whisper. 12 years ago, Beyondame didn't kill the Kyuubi," he said, interrupting the demon child's weak protests. "He sealed it into a baby. He sealed it into you. You are the demon fox, and that's why everybody hates you. It was because of you that so many people died, including your friend Irika's parents." The demon child looked stunned. Good. Now that he was off balance, it was time to go for the kill. "If you help me get out of here, I'll take you to a place where you'll be accepted. A place from which you can plan your revenge on those who kept you down and spat on you," he said, confident that his escape with the forbidden scroll was assured. 2 years ago, that little psychological attack would have been more devastating, and possibly even effective. Now, however, Naruto knew that not everyone hated him. Sure, the civilians were still a pain in the ass, but he had earned the respect of his fellow ninja, and he even had friends. He also knew enough about sealing to know that something had been sealed inside him, and that it had quite likely been the thing that had caused the blackout, or rather read out during the Kiri-chunin exams based on the whispers and hand signs between the Jounin. He hadn't known that it was the Kyuubi itself though, but it made sense considering the fact that the date of his birth coincided with the Kyuubi's attack. He also knew enough about sealing to know that he wasn't the thing that was sealed inside him, just the way a scroll wasn't a kunai, or a box of diapers or whatever. The thing that upset him the most about the Chunin's revelation was not the fact that something that big had been hidden from him all of his life, as such things sometimes happen to people in the shinobi world without anyone really being the wiser, but that the vaguely familiar man in front of him had asked him to betray Konoha, and fully expected him to do so. Bastard. A slightly evil smirk that anyone who had been on the wrong side of one of Naruto's pranks would recognize was all the warning the silver-haired jerk got. "Hey! There's someone stealing scrolls in here!" he yelled, hopefully getting the attention of the Hokage's guards who were apparently asleep on the job. The man was quick, but not quick enough. A Kawarimi put him out of the man's reach, and a dozen Kage Bunshin added to the confusion. He was pretty sure that the man would be caught soon, since the man would have a hard time fleeing with the severed Achilles tendon he'd received compliments of an overeager clone. Most of the weapons the man had on him aside from the standard kunai hadn't been meant close-quarters combat, and had been more of a hindrance than a help in this instance. The Hokage groaned tiredly as he ushered the Uzumaki boy into his private office. He hadn't planned on having this conversation with Naruto until the boy was much older, and he certainly hadn't planned on having it in the middle of the night, especially after a major disruption like the one that had disturbed him from his musings on who could have short-sheeted his bed and why. Considering Naruto's presence, he was reasonably certain he had the answer. As soon as he was seated at his desk, he invited the boy to ask him anything with the caveat that he wouldn't answer the boy if he felt that the child wasn't ready for the information, or if the answer to the question involved information that could compromise someone else or the village's safety. "Did my parents really die protecting me from the Kyuubi?" Naruto asked. He had given Naruto that little bit of information when the boy had come asking about his parents after his sensei had mentioned his mother's name and the fact that he'd known her nearly 2 years ago. He just knew that it would come back and bite him in the ass when he'd given it, and now it was. "Yes," he replied. "The Kyuubi attempted to attack you before it was sealed away, and though she was gravely injured, your mother managed to chain it down until it was sealed. Your father died soon after of injuries that had been acquired during the attack." "Why?" Naruto asked, apparently stunned by this revelation. He could see several questions in the boy's eyes. Why had his father been injured? Why had his mother protected him if she was going to allow a demon fox be sealed within him? Why had his mother allowed the fox to be sealed within him in the first place? He wasn't sure how or if he should answer these questions right now. He had planned on telling Naruto everything when he either made Jounin or turned 18, whichever came first, and had a letter for the boy that was only to be delivered to him under those conditions on it in case he died before he could tell him. While he could not risk parting with what, in his opinion, was the most dangerous secret for Naruto, he could risk parting with one secret that he would never have even considered parting with if he hadn't believed that Naruto would be able to handle it right now. "Your mother was the Kyuubi's previous host, having taken the position from the Shodai Hokage's wife who was dying of old age," he replied, carefully gauging the boy's reaction to this. "On the day you were born, someone had found a way to free the Kyuubi from her body and turn it against the village. She had barely survived the extraction process and was dying as a result of it, and knew that the only way for you and the rest of the village to be safe would be for the Kyuubi to be sealed in another person. She and the Yondaime entrusted you with it, and therefore the safety of the village as well. She loved you very much, and believed that you would be up to the task." He continued before the boy's shock at this could turn into something more dangerous. "The Yondaime had wanted you to be seen as a hero, but people were hurting and grieving at the time and had been looking for someone to blame. Some people are often blind to what is right in front of their faces, and I or nobody else for that matter can force them to see what's really there," he said sadly, remembering those early days when he'd been forced to pass that law so Naruto might possibly have comrades he could live and work with in the future, as shinobi from generations prior to his would have been exceedingly reluctant to accept him at best. "They will either have to come to see you for the hero that you are on their own, or not at all." There were tears in Naruto's eyes at this, and as he did his best to break the mood by telling the boy a story about his mother's days in the academy, and her frustration over a rather unfortunate nickname she'd been given before he sent him home, but still, he had managed to get a smile out of the boy before he departed. That smile gave him cause to hope. Naruto was resilient, and had recovered from so much already. After seeing that smile, he knew that the boy would be able to recover from this as well. Naruto walked slowly and on the ground on his way home, detouring past the Kia monument as he sometimes did, as he had a great deal to think about as he made his way across the village to his apartment. One fact stood out in his mind, however. When they had sealed the Kyuubi into him, both his mother and the Yondaime had trusted him to keep Konoha safe. As he looked at his mother's name on the Kia memorial, which most people's eyes tended to graze over because it was right below the Yondaime's, he quietly swore that he would not let his mother down. He would do everything in his power to keep Konoha and the villagers safe, even though most of the villagers didn't like him all that much, and he didn't like them all that much either. His mother had trusted him, and was counting on him. Morishita Kanako rested her head against the bar, gazing into the clear depths of a glass of some foreign drink whose name she couldn't pronounce in her current state of drunkenness. She'd spent a great deal of time here since she'd lost her team, trying to forget the pain, and trying to forget that she'd once had Gen in training under her altogether. She was rather startled when Tetsuo sat down next to her and ordered a drink. He never came in this late, or early rather, especially since his daughter had been born. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "There was an incident with Naruto," Tetsuo replied as his drink arrived. "He stopped a robbery in progress while he was at the tower to prank the Hokage." "You don't sound too happy about that," she said. "Are you still upset at him for giving Naruto to Kakashi as a bribe to get him to pass a team?" She took Tetsuo's dark look to be an affirmative. Despite the fact that the man hadn't initially cared for Naruto, he had become rather fond of the boy over the past 2 years, and had been exceedingly upset to learn that the boy was being taken from him. That kid could grow on anybody, herself included. Chapter 12: The New Team. Iruka sighed as he called the class to order. Mizuki should have been here, but he was currently entertaining the Tianai department because he had been caught trying to steal something by Naruto, who had snuck into the Hokage's residence to prank the Hokage, and had rather stupidly compounded his mistake by breaking a certain law that had been made shortly after Naruto's birth. Fortunately, the Hokage had been awake at the time, and had been able to defuse the situation after Naruto had incapacitated his wayward friend. Eventually, the class came to order, and he made his version of the standard graduation speech even though he knew he'd be seeing most of the class back here come January if they didn't drop out of the ninja program entirely before he started calling out the team assignments. When he got to the middle of the roster, he reached the one that had caught his interest when he had noticed it earlier. Such things had happened before, but usually in times of war. What usually happened when there were an odd number of graduates was that the spare or spares were sent out to fill gaps on already existing teams. Team 7 will be rather different this year, as there was an uneven number of graduates. Uchiha Sasuke and Haruno Sakura, you will be assigned with an already established genin, and your sensei will be Hatake Kakashi, he said with a slight smirk, deciding to let the identity of said genin be a rather unpleasant surprise after all of the things those two had said about Naruto over the past 2 years. He was still a bit of a prankster when the situation called for it. Naruto grumbled over the fact that he would have to show up on time despite the fact that he knew that his new sensei was going to be at least 2 hours late as he made his way to the classroom where he was supposed to be meeting his teammates and being picked up by the man. One of the reasons he hadn't dared to turn up late was because he'd heard the story of what had happened to the man who decided to show up according to Kakashi time, only to find a rather annoyed and somewhat irate Hatake Kakashi who had actually turned up on time for once in his life waiting for him. He didn't want to risk it, since it wasn't worth the probable consequences. Fortunately, he had thought ahead and brought some entertainment in the form of a book, a deck of cards in case his teammates were in the mood for playing, and his standard Jounin grade prank pack. The man fully deserved to be pranked for taking him away from Tetsuo-sensei. Shortly before Jounin, who'd been behind him, had arrived ordered to take their teams, he walked into the room, which was crowded with a batch of recent graduates, and sat down, ignoring the strange stares he was receiving. Long ago, when he'd attended the academy, this had been his classroom for more than a year. He guessed that was supposed to be feeling nostalgic by being here, but he wasn't. The closest he got to feeling anything approaching nostalgia upon his arrival had been when he'd seen Irika-sensei standing at the front of the room. As he looked around, he wondered which two of these students would be on his team, as he hadn't asked for a new copy of his orders to replace the one he'd destroyed before he'd reached the names of his future teammates. Once upon a time, these had been his classmates, and honestly, he'd forgotten most of them. He remembered Shikamaru, Chuji, Kiba and his dog, Sakura, and the bastard Sasuke, but that was about it, aside from the Hyuga girl that he noticed following him around when he was in the village. One brave soul, an orange-haired girl whom he vaguely thought he recognized as being one of the pack of Sasuke's followers, finally made her way over to him. "What are you doing here?" the girl asked in a dismissive manner. "I got assigned to Team 7, he replied, still slightly sore about the assignment because it meant that he would most likely have to wait at least a year to take the Chunin exams again. If he missed taking the exams too often, he'd start looking as bad as Yakushi Kabuto, whom he'd been informed by his former teammates had failed again, making it a grand total of 6 times. Several members of the group of graduates gave the Uchiha some rather odd glances after he said this, as if they thought he would start foaming at the mouth or explode or something along those lines. Considering how the bastard had been talking about him being an academy dropout for the last 2 years, he had a feeling he knew why. The Uchiha was ignoring them in favor of staring at him like he were an alien or something, however. All too soon, the group of jounin that he'd entered the academy ahead of arrived, much like they had when he had graduated 2 years earlier, and started calling for their teams. As he'd expected, Hatake Kakashi wasn't amongst them, and was most likely either sitting in a tree somewhere reading PRN, or staring at the Kia Memorial like he'd once caught him doing one of the times he'd stopped by there himself sometime after he'd found out that his mother's name was on it. 3 by 3, the genin started vanishing and, as they did, several of his hopes went with them. He would have been willing to tolerate Shikamaru or Chuji, who had vanished with Asuma-san when Team 10 was called. He would have also been able to tolerate Kiba, the bug boy, and that quiet Hyuga girl who constantly stalked him, but they'd gone when someone called for Team 8. Eventually, there were only 5 genin left in the room, and from the looks of it, he'd either have Hibachi or the Uchiha bastard on his team. Great. A shinobi he'd vaguely remembered seeing around the village called for Team 4, and Hibachi departed with the only girl in the room who wasn't Sakura and some boy whose name he couldn't recall for the life of him, which only left. Oh hell no! Just for this, the old man was going to be getting the special poison ivy toilet paper he'd picked up in the capital during that C rank where he'd accidentally ended up in the daimyo's bathroom. It was bad enough that the irresponsible and perpetually tardy Hatake Kakashi was going to be his new sensei, but to be on a team with them, even if it was only for 24 hours, on top of that. The next 2 hours he'd spent waiting for his new sensei were pure hell, and setting up the pranks for the man in question didn't even come close to beginning to make up for it. The Uchiha bastard had spent the entire time silently glaring at him as if he'd killed his puppy right in front of him, and then started on his family. The Haruno girl, who was no longer Sakura-chan to him, sat there staring at him as well, but her look and occasional whimpers told him that she expected him to attack her at any second, as if he were some rabid animal or something. After he'd finished setting up the pranks and settled down to wait, he found that he couldn't focus on his book with his new teammates staring at him like that, so he got out his deck of cards and set up a game of solitaire, which in his opinion had to be the most boring card game in the world. To make matters worse, Kakashi was a paranoid bastard who was well aware of his ability with traps, and evaded every last one of the damn things despite the chance that he thought he'd had a chance of catching him in at least one of them, like he had done Tetsuo-sensei that one day. Finally, after dodging the last flower bomb, Kakashi ordered the team to the roof. The instant this order had been given, He hopped out the window and ran up the side of the building, but still arrived several seconds behind Kakashi. He really had to learn how to do the shunshin one of these days. Sasuke and Sakura arrived about a minute later, slightly out of breath from having run up several flights of stairs, and soon, they were seated in front of Kakashi in a manner he recognized from the Team 5 introduction 2 years before. When Kakashi ordered them to introduce themselves, Sakura asked Kakashi to go first to show them how it was done. Complying with the Haruno girl's request, Kakashi then proceeded to give the standard, "My name is fill in the blank, and I'm not telling you crap" introduction. Based on the man's slightly perverted chuckle when he mentioned hobbies, he figured that they all had something to do either with sex or the more likely option of PRN, considering his well-known loner tendencies and the book he always carried about, and therefore weren't fit for the virgin ears of academy students. Since he was seated at the outside of the group, he was ordered to go first after Kakashi had finished his introduction. "My name is Uzumaki Naruto," he said, deciding to go with the format of his Team 5 introduction. "My favorite foods are Ichiraku ramen and red bean soup. My least favorite foods are vegetables. My hobbies are training, gardening, and pranking people. My dream for the future is to become Hokage." That bastard Uchiha, who naturally went next because he was sitting in the middle, would be paying dearly for that dismissive snort later. "My name is Uchiha Sasuke," the Uchiha bastard said after he'd finished his introduction. "I have a lot of dislikes, and there isn't anything I particularly like, and I don't have any hobbies. I won't categorize my ambition as a dream. My ambition is to restore my clan, and to kill a certain person." Well, wasn't that disturbing? Based on what he'd heard, the counseling that the Uchiha was supposed to have been in hadn't been effective. He was pretty sure that he knew who the person that Sasuke wanted to kill was, and that person was one of the main reasons for the argument against early graduation, Uchiha Itachi. Itachi had become a genin at 7, a chunin at 10, an ANBU captain at 12, and a mass murderer at 13 when he snapped and killed his entire clan barring himself and Sasuke. Sakura was last, and he hoped that her introduction wasn't anywhere near half as disturbing as Sasuke's had been. "My name is Haruno Sakura," the girl said. So far so good, but that was only her name. "I like," she said before not so subtly glancing over at Sasuke and blushing. "My hobbies are," she said before looking at Sasuke again and blushing. "Seriously?" With that, she just moved into the position of most likely to die first because there was a good chance that Sasuke would either sacrifice her in battle so he wouldn't have to deal with her anymore or just kill her himself. At some point over the years, the Haruno girl had apparently crossed the line between fangirl and crazed stalker. "My dream for the future is," the girl said, looking at Sasuke and blushing once more as she lost herself in a fantasy that most likely had her in a wedding dress or kimono, since he was pretty sure she wasn't old enough for the other type of fantasy he'd heard about from some of the older genin. His musings on the nature of the girl's fantasies were suddenly and violently interrupted when the girl gave out a most unholy ear-splitting squeal which had momentarily deafened him. "What about your dislikes?" Kakashi asked, sounding almost as if he dreaded the answer. "Naruto," she promptly said loudly and emphatically. Apparently he'd made something of an impression last time he saw her, and he wasn't all that fond of her anymore either, so it all worked out. He was somewhat amazed that she had had the courage to say that in front of him though, considering how she'd behaved earlier, and how she'd run off every time they'd run into each other since that incident. From the looks of things, he was going to have to do his best to sabotage whatever test Kakashi came up with tomorrow, otherwise it was going to be a losing year. The next chapter would be the sequel for this series. A wiser and more experienced Naruto is forced onto a team he hadn't wanted to join in the first place. However, as they say, those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash. Chapter 1: The Night Before. A wise man had once said that life is a long road that is easy to get lost on. At the moment, Naruto was feeling somewhat lost on that road. Looking back, he realized that he must have taken a wrong turn somewhere since, the road had gone in what in his opinion was a rather disturbing direction without him realizing it until it was too late. And before I could go up to her, Ino got her hands on her and turned her into rabid Sasuke fangirl number 2. Naruto said miserably to his companion that evening. He knew that he should be at home resting or preparing himself for whatever farce Kakashi decided to spring on him and his new team tomorrow, but he had needed someone to commiserate with about his sucky new assignment, and Suzume had shown up like a gift from heaven. After he'd run into her after she'd been leaving the administration complex at the end of the mission she'd been on for the last couple of weeks, they had gone to the bar that Tetsuo-sensei had brought them to celebrate Suzume and Satoshi's promotions to Chunin, since Ichiraku's was now reserved for high points during his life. The bar fit his mood quite nicely since it was both a place where shinobi tended to go to commiserate about their problems, and the place where his team had pretty much split apart. It had been a while since the team had split apart, and a while since he and Suzume had seen each other, so they had some catching up to do. As he was still a genin, he had gotten cranberry juice, but that was okay since he didn't like alcohol all that much anyway. Suzume had ordered sake because they were in a bar, but wasn't drinking very much of it. Based on the occasional winces, she seemed to share his views on the flavor of alcohol. Her cup had spent far more time on the table than it did in her hand, and the takuri was mostly full. Now I'm expected to be on a team with both of them, and I'm certain that Kakashi will know if I try and throw tomorrow's test and report me, and I'm still considering doing it anyway. He continued unhappily. I don't even know why Kakashi wants to be my sensei. I was perfectly happy with Tetsuo-sensei. Suzume quietly gave him a pitying look. Apparently, if it was her, she wouldn't have wanted to be stuck in the same situation he was in either. Tetsuo-sensei was a good teacher whom none of them would have traded for the world, and it had been his impression that Suzume and Satoshi would have eventually returned to the team after they'd had their chance to fly on a few B-ranked missions if this hadn't happened. And how was your mission? He finally asked after having forced his teammate to listen to him for over an hour. He'd been taught some manners over the years and knew that it wouldn't be polite to spend the entire evening trying to get some sympathy over his fate, and not offer a shoulder of his own should it be needed, even if his mood was a completely crappy one at the moment. He knew that something was up with Suzume as well, since she hadn't looked entirely happy when he'd run into her, but it was more of a my day was crappy unhappy rather than the my life just got completely steamrolled. Unhappy he was feeling. It absolutely sucked. Suzume replied. The client would not stop hitting on me. I wouldn't have minded it so much if he were young and handsome, but he had to be like 50, and he was missing half his teeth. On the way back, we decided to stop at an onsen. Unfortunately for us in this case, it was a mixed bath. What should have been a very relaxing evening was completely ruined when this white-haired pervert stared at me and Eri the entire time, not even bothering to try and hide the fact that he was doing so. As Suzume shared her problems, he listened to his teammate as attentively as he could. Not only was it the polite thing to do, but you never knew what you could learn when you did so. Someone had once let a good bit of blackmail material slip without realizing it in his presence, and he would have missed it if he hadn't been paying attention. Since then, he never wasted an opportunity to needle the person in question with his knowledge he'd gained every time he encountered him. Right now, however, he was providing a sympathetic ear for his teammate, and a shoulder to cry on since she had done the same for him. Sasuke growled as he pummeled the training dummy with his fists. The idiot, the moron, the dead last had been a genin for 2 years, and he hadn't so much not noticed it as refused to believe it until he'd had his nose rubbed in undeniable proof of the fact. The person who had been held up as being the most likely to fail since day one at the academy had surpassed him and left him in the dust long before he'd even realized that he'd flown by, and instead of trying to catch up and surpass him like he should have been doing, he'd spent 2 years ignoring the now very obvious dust cloud that had been left in his wake. As he pummeled the dummy he was training with, he reviewed his and the Uzumaki's time at the academy together, trying to see if there were signs of when and how this had happened. As he thought back on it, There had been one phrase that constantly came out of the mouth of the boy who, now that he thought about it, managed to catch a chunin in a trap that only utilized a chalkboard eraser and a bit of grease. And that was, "I was joking." Shuriken go flying everywhere except the target, and nearly take out the sensei. I was joking. Kunai hits a bird passing overhead rather than the stationary target 5 feet below it. I was joking. The assistant instructor's kneecap nearly gets broken due to a wild and unpredictable move. You get the picture. Every single time after every single failure, he'd hear "I was joking." Back then, he had thought that it had been the idiot's way of trying to cover for his obvious inadequacies, especially considering the fact that the boy couldn't even do a proper bunshin. He was wrong, however. Apparently, the Uzumaki really had just been joking around. The little bastard had played him. He'd played all of them, and when he'd gotten bored with his little game, he went and blew through the graduation exam like it was nothing. Now, knowing that the Uzumaki could have graduated any time he'd wanted to, he tried to think it through to find a logical reason for why he would do such a thing. It didn't make sense. Why would the Uzumaki do something like that, something so absolutely pointless, when he could be well on his way in his ninja career? After several moments of thought, he finally remembered the most likely reason for why the Uzumaki behaved the way he had. After that man had killed the clan, the laws had been changed, and the lowest age at which anyone could graduate the academy had been raised to 10. Because of this, the Uzumaki had been forcibly held back for who knew how many years. Long and tedious years in which the Uzumaki had undoubtedly grown bored just as he had neared the end of his stay at the academy. He'd heard stories about geniuses who were held back and destroyed their surroundings out of sheer boredom. One of the reasons Uchiha Madara had been sent out on the battlefield at such a young age had been because of the chaos he had been causing in the clan encampment. While Naruto hadn't been setting tents on fire and destroying cooking pots, he had caused enough chaos that the academy had finally been willing to let him go, and been glad of it. Now, knowing what the Uzumaki was, he knew that he would have to find a way to surpass him before he would be ready to kill that man. If he could find a way to defeat one true genius, he would be able to find a way to defeat another. Sakura checked her supplies again, feeling apprehensive about what the morning and the future following it would hold. She would be taking a test with her team, a test that would decide the team's future, including even if they would still be a team following the test, and she feared how Sasuke would react if she caused them to fail. Sasuke would be extremely disappointed, and probably would reject her in favor of Ino. Naruto would. On the day Naruto had pinned her and threatened her, she had complained to her mother about how Naruto had threatened to break her arm practically the instant she got home. Her mother had promptly dragged her down to the office of the civilian peacekeeping force that had risen up in the wake of the Uchiha massacre to deal with civilian-on-civilian crime to make a report. Once they got there, her mother had stormed straight up to the desk of the first officer she spotted, dragging her in her wake. "I want that monster arrested!" her mother yelled, as soon as she had gotten the attention of the officer she dragged her in front of. "Who are you talking about, ma'am?" the female officer asked, as she tried to calm her mother down. "The Uzumaki boy, who else?" her mother replied. After her mother's demand, the officer went over to a computer and started putting in information. Whatever results she received once the information had been processed had caused a frown to mar her rather plain features. She looked rather apologetic when she returned soon after. "I'm sorry," the officer said when she reached her desk where she and her mother were standing. "Uzumaki Naruto is a registered shinobi, and therefore you'll have to file your complaint at the administration complex." Snarling obscenities under her breath, her mother grabbed her, turned, angrily stormed out of the station, and dragged her all the way to the administration complex, where she then dragged her all the way over to the desks where people registered civilian complaints against shinobi. "I would like to file a complaint against Uzumaki Naruto," her mother said to the bored-looking ninja at the desk the instant she arrived. "What is the nature of this complaint?" the ninja asked, grabbing a form and a pen. "That filthy little monster threatened to break my daughter's arm," her mother replied. At what time was this threat made, and where were you and what were you doing at the time? The Chunin asked as he started filling out information on the form. I was outside the academy. I had just gotten out of class for the day, and noticed him hanging around on that swing in the tree near the entrance. I tried to hit him, she replied, deciding to leave the for pretending to be a ninja part out considering the reason for her current location. Let me get this straight, the man said coldly as he crumpled the form that he'd started filling out. You, an academy student, decided to attack a full-fledged shinobi who is only a genin because he had a run of seriously bad luck, and isn't currently on his way to the Chunin exams because we don't want to give IWA a chance to legally get their revenge on him for what he did to 2 of their genin. And you want us to punish him because he decided to go easy on you and let you off with a warning? As they say, hindsight is 20/20. She should never have let her mother drag her to the tower considering the fact that Naruto had already informed her of what would happen, and she should never have asked what Naruto had done to those IWA genin. The desk ninja who had apparently heard the story from a friend of his who was a jounin who had been to the Chunin exams and Kiri had gleefully told her in vivid and extremely gruesome detail. Funny, Sasuke had never seemed to notice that she had kept silent about Naruto's ninja status or lack thereof after that. If Naruto had been willing to do something like that to people who had just gotten in the way of his promotion, what would he do to her if she failed tomorrow's test? That question haunted her for the rest of the evening as she prepared, hoping that she didn't mess up and upset either Naruto or Sasuke-kun. Kakashi polished one of the bells against his sleeve before checking it again for any spots or smudges. Everything had to be perfect for tomorrow, including the bells that had been in use since the night aim had first taken a team. Because Omaru, Minato-sensei's son, would be his student. Despite the fact that the kid seemed to resent the fact that he'd been taken from his other sensei, and the fact that he was Chunin in all but name, it would be worth it. He owed it to Minato-sensei to make sure that Naruto was at least half the man he had been. He had failed everyone else. Obito was gone, Rin was gone, Kushina-san was gone, and Minato-sensei was gone. Naruto was all he had left. That's it for part 2. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.